brother, mainstream media, government cover-ups. You want answers? Well, so does he. He's Alex Jones on the GCN Radio Network. And now, live from Austin, Texas, Alex
Welcome
Jones.
to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight on this Friday, April 4th, 2014. And we're going to be covering a lot of news. Now, of course, Captain America previewed last night, and I'm probably about the only person here at Infowars that didn't see it. It's a tough job, but somebody's got to go see the movies, and we've got some reports on that from Jakari Jackson and McAdoo. We promise we're not going to have any spoilers in there. We've also got a couple of special reports from Alex Jones, instructions from the government, actually, on how to deal with tyranny. Also, another special report on climate change. And we've got a lot of breaking news. One of the top stories on Infowars that just came out this morning was on the Constitutional Convention and the specter that we could have a new Constitutional Convention to go back and revisit everything, essentially. Is that the problem? Is that a solution? Is that a solution? Is the Constitution the problem, or is it maybe the people who are in government that's the problem? And what happens if we replace the Constitution, we take out the law that is really very good, and we replace it with something else that essentially gives them cover for their illegal activities? Can we trust the people in charge now to run a constitutional convention? If we make it better, if we make it more explicit, if we take out some of the wiggle room that they've inserted, because there really isn't wiggle room. It's really their interpretations of it. It's really pretty clear. Is it going to get worse? Well, we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about, of course, the Fort Hood shooting. There's a story up on Drudge Report about the common connection with this shooting and with other shootings, and that is SSRI drugs. Not PTSD, but the government has a long history of how they deal with veterans with PTSD. We're going to look at the past, the present, and the future, and it involves people like DARPA. And we can also take a look at what's going on with this EPA human testing story, which we broke here on Infowars. The lawsuit was started back in September 2012. Steve Malloy with junkscience.com had started his investigations of what was going on in North Carolina, and he had already broken that, I guess, a couple of weeks before the lawsuit was filed, but that was broken on Infowars about a year and a half ago, and of course it went to trial. They tried to get a temporary restraining order, so we're going to have an update on that. We also have updates on a lot of police brutality. It's just amazing how every day we're seeing more and more reports of police not even pretending to follow any reasonable procedures, just coming in as thugs, attacking people, invading their homes, pointing guns at children, locking down schools because they see a tripod. And we're going to talk about the logical conclusion of that, and maybe one of the driving forces. There's a lot of things driving it. It's being driven from the federal government. That's why it's happening all over America. It's the way the police are being trained. They're being conditioned that they are no longer under any restraints. And of course, no matter what they do, nothing ever happens to them. We're going to be talking about another aspect of that, not just the push from Homeland Security. We're going to be talking about the pull from private prisons. We're going to be talking about a scandal that just broke in Arizona about private prisons. We also have some economic news. We have some civil liberties economic news. Venezuela is enforcing fingerprint registries in order to buy groceries. That sounds pretty crazy, doesn't it? Could that happen here? Is it maybe already happening here to some degree? When you go to the grocery store and you sign up for a discount with your card, are they creating a paper trail that the government can then use? Because we've had some executive orders that come down that line. So we're going to be talking about that. Another topic we're going to cover today is Judge Napolitano. He says we need to jail James Clapper. Yes, absolutely. And Judge Napolitano makes a very good case for that based on what James Clapper has just said. There are a lot of people in Washington that need to go to jail. That's why I'm concerned about the Constitutional Convention. Because if we're not willing to stand for the laws that we have now that are being broken, what good does it do even if we get a stronger, more strongly worded Constitution? We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight. I'll be your host today. We have a very jam-packed show. And of course, Captain America previewed last night. We're going to have Jakari Jackson and Leanne McAdoo come in and give us their non-spoiler review. Of course, we have a review that is up. If you've already seen it, you can get our take on it, our Liberty take on that film. But that has some spoilers in it. We're not going to have spoilers because I haven't seen it. And I don't want to know what's in it before I see it. And you don't either if you haven't seen it yet. But we're going to have a review about that. Alex is going to be joining us at the bottom of the hour with a special report. He's also going to have one later in the show on climate change. The one at the bottom of the hour is really going to be on how do you deal with tyranny. You know, we actually have some instructions from the government on how to do that. And we're also going to have a lot of breaking news about Constitutional Convention, what's going on with the Fort Hood shooting, and something that is even bigger than that. And that is, what is the reaction to the shooting? How are people coming after guns? How are they coming after the soldiers? We see a lot of conservatives who are throwing people under the bus that they say have PTSD. But of course, as the article that's up on Drudge, our article from Paul Joseph Watson and Alex Jones yesterday, made it very clear that the connecting factor with all of these mass shootings are SSRI drugs. Kit Daniels and Jakari Jackson went to the press conference at Fort Hood, and they asked the question that everybody wanted to know, was he on SSRIs? Because that is the common thread that we have seen with all these shootings, and the answer was clearly yes. And so that's part of the problem, taking guns away from soldiers who are entrusted. As we saw pictures on the Daily Mail, we saw pictures of this soldier who did the shooting. We saw him carrying all kinds of guns, large caliber guns, rocket launchers. If you're going to say that the military can't be trusted with firearms, with sidearms, when you're giving them the state-of-the-art, heaviest equipment, not even just firearms, but you're putting them in tanks, you're giving them missiles, whatever. If you can't trust people with those weapons, with a sidearm, how can you trust them with those weapons? It's very much like the TSA hassling airline pilots over nail clippers, isn't it? You're putting the airline pilots, they're in the driver's seat of the airplane. They can turn that into a missile if they want to. The same thing with the military. If they can't be trusted to protect themselves, they can't be trusted to protect us either, can they? But we're going to be talking about something that's even beyond that, and that is, what is the government's history with PTSD? And what are they planning to do in the future about it? And DARPA is involved in that. They have a very, very shameful history of the way they have treated, going back to World War II. There was a wonderful expose in the Wall Street Journal. We're going to be talking about that. But before we start this, I want to talk about the Constitutional Convention. This just came up on Infowars this morning, an article from Paul Joseph Watson. Could the U.S. Constitution be changed to eliminate the Second Amendment? He points out the entire U.S. Constitution could be up for review after Michigan became the 34th state to vote in favor of a constitutional convention. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution states that Congress, quote, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, unquote, should the two-thirds requirement be met. And it was last week when Michigan lawmakers endorsed the move. Now, Representative Duncan Hunter from California wants this to start. And we've already seen a lot of people pushing back. Former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens said he thinks that the Second Amendment has to go. Of course, so does Piers Morgan. But actually, he went and said instead of the Second Amendment. But Justice Stevens says that he thinks that we could improve the Constitution by changing the right to keep and bear arms and making it only apply to those in the quote-unquote militia and not the general public at large. Well, when he says that, that means that he doesn't really understand what the militia is. The militia is not the army. That was made very clear from anybody who knows anything about the historical writings and the tension going back and forth between the militia and the regular army at the time of the Revolutionary War. There was a very clear understanding that the militia was the armed citizenry. And it was very clear in the Constitution that the militia was there to put down rebellions, to defend us against foreign invasions. And it was very clear in the Constitution that the military was not supposed to be a permanent organization. They were not to be a standing army. They were very concerned about a standing army. We've had a standing army now for 60 years. And they warned that the means of our defense abroad would become the instruments of tyranny at home. And that's what we're very concerned about when we look at Homeland Security When we look at the federal government militarizing the police and using the police as military, we see the confluence of that in the NDAA Act, the section that Obama signed that said that the military could arrest people in the United States, American citizens in the United States, hold them indefinitely without trial, transport them with extraordinary rendition to other places where they could presumably be tortured. As we now learn in the documents that the Senate Intelligence Committee has put out, we learn that, yes, that has been going on for quite some time. And yes, the intelligence that they got from that was not effective. It was things that they already knew. It was garbage intelligence. They were simply torturing people, criminal acts, torturing people. Well, the concern that I have, and we should all think about this with the Constitutional Convention, is if we have people who don't obey the law, will they obey the law if it's more strongly, more clearly worded? Because that's what we're looking at. Now, the other jeopardy, of course, is that the government is always trying to make legal the illegal things that they're doing. Just the fact that they have prohibitions against so much of what they're doing doesn't stop them from spying on all of us with Dragnet spying with the NSA. But they're constantly trying to use people like Mike Rogers and others to justify it, to make a legal case for the criminal actions that they're engaged in. And that's what could come out of a constitutional convention. On the other hand, the best case scenario is, let's say that we get something that is extremely well worded and clear about Dragnet spying with the NSA, that's clear about the Second Amendment being a right of the people. I don't know how you make that any more clear. When we say it's a right of the people, it's not of the government. It's not of the government's military. It's of the people. That's why it's talking about a militia, but it is an individual right. The Supreme Court has said it's an individual right, so now maybe they need a constitutional convention to try to rewrite that. The problem is that our rights transcend the Constitution. They don't derive from it. The Constitution recognizes fundamental rights that we all possess as individuals, rights that are inalienable to us as individuals. And when we allow the government to trample on those rights, that's a very serious thing. The Constitution was set there to make it very clear, to respect those rights. So what do we do when the government totally ignores it? And is it going to make them respond to it if we make it even more clear? Of course it won't. Take a look at some of these police brutality cases that have just surfaced within the last 24 hours. It's absolutely amazing. We've got a video here of a man. This is a guy, 26 years old. He's in Louisiana, and neighbors call the police. And the cop comes in, and this is a very long video. We're not going to have time to play all of it. To give you an idea of what's happening, the guy comes in, the cop just barges his way in, and the guy's going, what's going on? What's going on? Asking for an explanation. Why are you doing this? Why are you arresting me? I'm afraid of you. Don't shoot me, because the guy's reaching around to grab stuff. The cop won't say anything. He just keeps doing what he's doing, doesn't give any reason, doesn't say you're under arrest, doesn't do anything. Let's play that video.
I'm going to get the ID, but you're attacking me for I'm attacking you to get out here. Sir, I'm here. Why?
Now, this is a cop. He's pushing his way into the house. The person who videotaping it is standing outside the house. You see the cop shoving his way through the door, and the guy's just talking. I'll let him talk.
Come to the house. Look, I am scared. I do not know what you're doing. I'll sit down.
You ain't do anything.
But I'm scared. You have me.
Wait, how you
now the guy with the camera is going in.
You didn't give no reason.
The person is sitting down on a couch, and the cop is standing in front of him.
Eric, don't leave. No, this is wrong. What are you doing?
Threatening the guy taking the picture, I should add, not explaining what he's doing. Now the cop is jumping on him on the couch, shoving him down,
Look at what you're doing.
putting handcuffs on him.
You're under arrest. For what? That's what I'm asking, sir. That's all I'm asking.
You're under arrest for resisting arrest.
That's all I'm asking.
There you go. There you go.
You can't just arrest me for
Welcome to Kafka Meets 1984.
Can I see your phone, please?
Help! Eric!
This officer, you harassing everybody over here.
Sir, what is your problem, sir?
You're under arrest for resisting arrest. He didn't resist arrest. He's asking for an explanation. He didn't lay a hand on the cop. He didn't do anything. He was being as passive as he could. Amazingly passive, amazingly restrained. It's the cop who is the aggressor.
What are you doing?
D, just let him go. Let him cut.
He's trying to take me to jail.
That's enough of that. Well, let's go to another one here.
I am scared, son.
Now, as bad as that is, we're going to have, after the break, another one where cops are pulling a gun on kids in a tree fort. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where the police are coming into our neighborhoods, into our homes, attacking us. We'll be right back with that video. Stay tuned. Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, your host, and we are in constant sorrow as we see these continuing police state episodes. As I mentioned just before the break, when we're talking about a constitutional convention and we're trying to clarify things, many of us would like to see things clarified, stronger language put in there. That may not happen. We may lose the language that we've got in there. They may make a case for themselves, cut themselves free from the chains that they have in the Constitution right now. But they've already cut themselves loose from the chain. They already ignore clear prohibitions. And as I said just before the break, where the rubber meets the roads is the cops in our neighborhoods and in our homes. We just played a clip from a guy who was 26 years old in Louisiana. And we got a cop who comes in, pushes his way inside the home, no explanation. The guy wants to know his name, wants to know what he's doing there. Why are you arresting me? The cop says, I'm not answering you. You answer to me. No, you answer to the Constitution you swore an oath to, or you don't have any legitimate authority. And we don't want to see that Constitution changed. Why was he put under arrest? Because he was resisting arrest. Does that sound like something out of a Franz Kafka novel? It is. It's Franz Kafka with an Orwellian boot stomping on the face of the public. Now, it's not just that. We've got, in the last 24 hours, we've got another one. Look at this. Cop pulls gun on fifth graders building a tree fort. This is also on Infowars.com. Mikhail Thalen. Police in Georgia forced a group of fifth graders to the ground at gunpoint this week as they attempted to build a tree fort in their own neighborhood. According to 9/11 records, the police were called after a neighbor, a snitch neighbor, noticed the children, quote, chopping off tree limbs, and an activity that she said was hurting the environment and creating tripping hazards. So that clearly justifies the cops showing up and pointing guns at fifth graders. Let's take a look at that clip that we've got here.
11-year-old son Amari, a star student, had a terrifying run-in with Henry County Police.
Well, he was crying.
The drama started while Omari and a few buddies, all around the same age, built a fort in the trees after school last week. Baptiste says when two officers rolled up, one of them had his gun drawn.
All he could get out at the time was, Mom, he had a gun in my face. He had a gun in my face.
911 records show a neighbor in the next subdivision had called in to complain the kids were chopping off tree limbs. Still,
as long as I got him to calm down, then he told me, how he had them on the ground and they had to spread their legs as if they were robbing a store.
She says the officers also used foul language to the boys, and when he took Amari home,
he just came with such an attitude. His whole physical appearance was one of, I'm Mr. Big and Bad.
No arrest, but Baptiste filed an excessive force complaint with the department.
You can understand, of course, why these parents
all right, let's stop it right there. Yeah, I think it's time that we all file an excessive complaint force with the police before they do that to our kids, before they do it to us. We see this excessive force being used everywhere, and the police coming back and saying, I was afraid, or they were resisting me, whatever they want to use. But it is also the panic of the public. And a lot of that is being driven by the mainstream news media, by the federal government. Look at this case out of Maryland. This is in Baltimore. Police go to an academy and they lock it down because a journalism student's tripod is mistaken for a weapon. Same kind of panic that they just did with this tree fort thing. But, I'm reminded, remember Pastor Martin Niemöller's famous quote about the Nazis? And he said, they came for the Jews, they came for this group, and I didn't do anything because I wasn't part of that group. I wasn't part of the next group. I wasn't part of the group after that. And eventually they came for me, and there was nobody left to help me. Now, you may think that this isn't going to affect you because maybe you don't climb trees or whatever. You're not a kid climbing trees anymore. There are middle-aged adults, 70-year-olds, who are filing complaints all over the place now because they're driving in other states with Colorado license plates, and they're getting pulled and given the full drug inspection treatment just because they've got Colorado license plates. That's the paranoia. That's the insanity of the police, but there's a reason for that. It's not just being pushed from Washington, from Homeland Security. It's also being pulled by the private prison system. And there's some breaking news out of that we're going to have later in the show out of Arizona. Give you an example of what's going on with private prisons. This is something that started in the 80s. It is a bipartisan problem. Obama could stop it with his pen and his phone if he wanted to, but he has connections to these corporatists as well. This started under the Reagan administration with zero tolerance and mandatory minimum drug sentencing, but it is something that could be stopped. Now, what do we do about this kind of tyranny? Well, Alex Jones has a report right after the break. The government actually tells us what to do when we encounter predators, and tyranny is just predation. So we're going to have that report right after the break from Alex Jones. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and I've got a report from Alex that we're going to play in just a second. It's actually how the government tells us to deal with predators is really the same way we need to deal with tyrants. And as we were just covering in the last few segments, people are calling for a constitutional convention. Many people believe that with clearer language, maybe the criminals in Washington would obey the people. But hey, you know what? Lois Lerner and the current IRS commissioner don't care about Congress. They don't care about the sorts of orders for an investigation that when Congress did that to Nixon, they impeached him. And of course, one of the other articles of impeachment with Nixon was that he used the IRS against political enemies. So there's two of the three right there, just in that one scandal. Of course, when Nixon asked the IRS to do it, the commissioner saved the paper, said he didn't do it. But now we have the IRS actively and openly doing this, because the IRS, let's understand, the IRS has been used by Republicans and Democrats to punish their political enemies for a very long time. That explains, really, in my opinion, why the Republicans are not doing anything. They're like a bad parent saying, I really mean it this time. If you don't give me those emails from 2010 in January, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to say that you're in contempt. I mean, come on. And then they don't do it. If you're a parent and you tell your kids, all right, I'm going to count to 10 and you better do what I say at that point in time, you know what? They're not, and then you don't do it even then, they're not going to pay any attention to you. Giving them ultimatums like that, especially ultimatums that you don't enforce, is the way to be a very, very weak and effective parent or a weak and effective legislature, because they don't care. But they think that they're going to have the reins of power again, and they're going to use the IRS to punish their political enemies. That's why they're not doing anything about it except trying to score some cheap political points. But the danger about all this is that when they do it in the open, when they pull this out and they show it to everybody, and they pull back the veil and they show all the corruption behind the curtain, and then they do nothing about it, they have taken us to an all-new low level. That's the real danger of an ineffective and corrupt government. And so we were talking about, where does that meet the road? Well, it meets the road at the point where the police start invading our homes, like the videos that we were just showing before this, where they start pointing guns at our children, where they start pulling over senior citizens and giving them a drug treatment, looking for drugs in their car, pulling over 3 or 4 patrol cars showing up, rousting the guy out of his car, putting drug dogs in his car simply because he's got a Colorado license plate and he's in a neighboring state? Really? Is that the kind of society that you want to live in? Maybe you don't have a Colorado license plate, but you know what? You're living under the government that is encouraging our citizens to be treated as suspects. Remember, this is the same government that put out those no hesitation targets, and they had children as well as pregnant women, as well as elderly. That's what we're seeing in these cases. So what do we do about these kinds of predators? Alex Jones has an idea.
We're here at Big Bend National Park, and everywhere we see lessons that are applicable in Mother Nature, but also in human interactions with bullies. And when I'm talking about bullies, I'm talking about government itself, historically the biggest bully and the largest danger to human populations. Of course, the University of Hawaii did a big study about it a decade or so ago, finding that government conservatively killed in non-military related deaths 262 million people in the 20th century. And government is already online in the 21st century to break that record. Now, what does that have to do with Big Bend? I'll tell you right now. Look at this. Lion warning. A lion has been frequenting this area and could be aggressive towards humans. If you see a lion, pick up small children. Stand together, appear large. Wave arms, shout aggressively. Throw stones or sticks. Report sightings to a ranger. Do not show fear, crouch down, run away. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. When humans act aggressive and defend their private property and are armed, predators, whether they're bullies or mountain lions, whatever the case is, don't come after you. When you grovel, like to the TSA, and bow down, and someone in a uniform becomes God, that's the essence of North Korea, the essence of Mexico, the essence of tyranny.
A TSA agent was arrested on January 3rd and was behaving erratically, saying, "I am God, I'm in charge."
And so the answer is to be basically a noble savage who's into science and technology and is informed, but at the same time retains your human instinct to not be a prey animal, but to quite frankly be a predator. That's what's happening is subgroups of humans in government are engaged in predator activity on us. That's called tyranny. We're supposed to form family units, cultural units that defend each other and build a better civilization based on Renaissance, art, literature, not based on the rule of the thug. So next time tyrants are in your face, don't show fear, don't crouch down and lick the hand that feeds you. Don't bow down, don't run away. Stand up. Stand together as communities. That's why they're destroying families. That's why they're playing men and women off against each other. That is the plan. So come together, folks. Unity. Unity for the basic Bill of Rights and Constitution. Alex Jones signing off for Infowars.com. We're going to go back to a report from a year ago that David Knight filed, similar to this one, pointing out the correlation to bears and how you should behave around them.
I'm David Knight, reporting for Infowars Nightly News. Just before I left for Austin, I took my family to the Smoky Mountains. Now, long before the Europeans named it the Smoky Mountains, the Cherokee had a name for it, and if I pronounce it correctly, it's something like Shakonoquay, which means place of the fine particulate smog. No, not actually. That's what the EPA wants you to think. I was surprised to see this graphic on the EPA's site where they explain what PM 2.5 is. They use the Smoky Mountains as a poster child. Is it really PM 2.5 and man-made smog that makes the Smoky Mountains smoky? No. We all know that it isn't, but we see this kind of thing done over and over again, like they did with polar bears on ice floes. Remember that? And of course, Al Gore is telling us that the oceans are rising, but he builds his $9 million mansion in Montecito, California, right on the ocean side. So I don't think he believes that either. But they use these subliminal messages to try to convince us, and they can be quite effective. And speaking of bears, every visitor to the Smoky Mountains gets a handout that looks like this, warning you about black bears. As my wife was reading that to the small children, I started thinking a lot of the stuff they were saying about bears could be said about government, especially about the EPA. Let me just read a few things here. With aggressive behavior, the bear, the EPA, is demanding more space. If the bear or EPA continues to follow you, stand your ground. If the EPA gets closer, talk louder or shout at it. Act aggressively. Act together as a group if you have companions. Make yourself look as large as possible. Don't run, don't turn away, and don't feed the EPA. It only encourages further problems. It's David Knight for Infowars Nightly News. First report that I did when I came here, and of course, the thing that was breaking at that point in time, Alex had already talked to someone a year and a half ago, just before I got here, about the EPA's human testing program that was going on right there in North Carolina, trying to make a case for fine particulate matter. You know, a year earlier, Lisa Jackson had said that as many people died from fine particulate matter, that would be things like wood smoke, okay, as people who were dying from cancer. It was a set-up press conference with her and Representative Markey. He was feeding her questions, and they wanted to emphasize that. That was a narrative that they wanted to come out of that, was that it was so dangerous that they had as many people dying from that as they did from cancer. That was in September of 2011. And she made it very clear. She said, I'm not talking about people getting sick. I'm talking about it actually killing you. Now, at the time she was doing that dog and pony show at the Congressional Committee, they also had the EPA in North Carolina hooking people up directly to diesel fumes, diesel exhaust coming out of a truck, running it through a pipe onto a mask on their face in a small room. And that was what they were doing at the time, trying to make a case to increase the regulations against fine particulate matter. And we see now on Drudge, last couple of days, it's come back in the news because we picked up on the story here at Infowars as the group that Steve Malloy was associated with. His website is junkscience.com. And it was American Tradition Institute at the time that filed a lawsuit, a temporary restraining order that they were trying to get to stop this experimentation on people. And of course, it got to their attention because Steve Malloy happened to notice that this lady was sent to the hospital as part of some EPA tests. It turns out that they were actually selecting for people who had heart conditions and respiratory conditions because they wanted to try to make it look as bad as possible. But we have a government that is every bit capable of doing horrible human experimentation with people, as we pointed out earlier this week when I talked to Alex about the EPA story. And we've got a story that I think we haven't covered so much here at Infowars, a story about the government's history with PTSD and the way they treated World War II veterans, and something even more frightening. And that is what DARPA is proposing to do in the future to cure PTSD. But before we get away from this, I want to talk about, before we get away from police brutality, I want to talk about why the government is doing this in so many cases. Of course, it's being pushed from Washington, it's being pushed from Homeland Security, but it is also being pulled from the private prison system. Look at this story that broke this week in Arizona. Arizona Republicans try to pump $1 million into private prison for non-existent inmates. Now, this is a situation where they have a contract with a prison company, and we had a lot of these contracts put in after Reagan put in the zero tolerance and the mandatory minimum prison sentences in 1984 for part of the drug war. That was when he went from going after the people who were supplying drugs to the end user. That was something that we had not seen during alcohol prohibition. And while we're talking about alcohol prohibition, while we're talking about a constitutional convention that people are trying to get involved here, let's understand that they don't pay any attention to the Constitution as it is right now. It took a constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol, didn't it? And it took another one to make it legal again to undo that amendment. Why did it take a constitutional amendment to make alcohol prohibition illegal? Because clearly in the Constitution they had no authority to do that. The 10th Amendment makes it clear that any powers that are not explicitly delegated to the federal government, they don't have. And they did not have the explicit permission to prohibit anything. Alcohol, shoelaces, marijuana, it doesn't matter. They don't have the legal authority to do it. Now, the difference between the 1920s and the 21st century is that in the 1920s, they took the Constitution seriously. They don't even take it seriously. Why would we even bother to have a constitutional convention if we've got a bunch of crooks who don't take their oath seriously, who don't pay any attention to what's in the Constitution? They now prohibit everything. And you can't do anything, whether it is a prescription drug or whether it's vitamins. In many cases they're trying to outlaw vitamins, or whether it's recreational drugs. Everything is prohibited unless expressly permitted by the FDA. That's the way they have turned this on its head. So when Reagan started with mandatory minimums sentencing, and he started with zero tolerance, that was a new thing. They started putting so many people in jail that they were having to let violent criminals out. Rapists and murderers are being turned out because their hands were tied. They had to follow the orders of the federal government, or so they said. Actually, they were following the orders so they could get the money from the federal government. That's the way the government, the feds always work. So we created this massive system of private prisons. And what is that doing? That's putting a pull on the arrest records. Look at these statistics. It costs nearly 4 times as much to keep an inmate in jail for a year as it costs to send a child to school for a year. We have 5% of the global population, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners. We have more prisoners than China does, and they've got a country that is many times larger than ours in population. We've got 1 in 15 black men are in prison. And we have 1 in 13 African Americans unable to vote due to laws that deny the right to vote to ex-felons. And, of course, people are being arrested for things that in many cases do not threaten other people. In many cases, as we've talked about with marijuana, quite frankly, whatever your position is on marijuana legalization, the government doesn't have the authority. The federal government does not have the authority to prohibit that. If they did, there wouldn't be a constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol. But let's take a look at this Arizona story here. Private prison company GEO Group coaxed about $1 million out of Arizona Republicans despite assertions by the State Department of Corrections that the money's not needed based on the state's contract with the GEO Group. Now, this is a guy, he's a Republican. His name is Kavanaugh, and he said, well, last week they came back and they said, look, can you give us like at least $900,000? I thought that was reasonable. So he sticks it in the budget at the very last minute. Now, they came back, the GEO Group had a reaction to this, and they say that they have a contract with the state of Arizona that provides for annual inflationary cost adjustments. They haven't received one since 2007. The requested increase this year would have represented a 2% inflationary adjustment. Well, fine. But that doesn't explain why it was put in at the last minute very quietly like that. And that's the way it's being represented by Chad Campbell, a Democrat from Phoenix. He said it was slipped in the last minute, obviously behind closed doors. GEO happened to donate more than $2,500 to Kavanaugh's 2012 campaign, according to documents from the Arizona Secretary of State. It's absolutely amazing to see this. Now, Arizona, like many places, has contracts with these private prisons where they're guaranteed 95 to 100% occupancy in these private prisons. Now, the prison system in question, they have a 97% occupancy. They've got 2,466 out of 2,530 prison beds occupied. Isn't that great? We've got the police doing their job, aren't they? You know, filling up those prisons for the private companies who then use these guys as slave labor to boot. It's a very, very corrupt system. And in Arizona, all but one House Republican supported the measure. They need to get that guy's name and give him a pat on the back. But there's a great article that came out from Dave Hodges. I saw it on dcclothesline.com, and he really pulls this back. This is a bipartisan problem. This is something that started with Reagan, but it is something that has continued on through the Democrat administrations of Clinton and of Obama. And he points out that Obama is making money on privatized prisons and slave labor. It's not just a Republican situation. They're both involved in this. And he points out, of course, as I just mentioned, that this goes back to 1984 when Reagan stepped up the war on drugs and took it to the end user. But he says, and he's writing from Arizona, he says, your state is my state. And it has political whores that are beholden to privatized prison globalist corporations. And it's time the facts behind the privatization of prisons are told. And this conspiracy reaches right to the White House. We're going to be back with more information about this right after the break. And we're going to have a review of Captain America, so stay tuned. Jakari Jackson and Leanne McAdoo are going to give us their take on it from last night. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show on this Friday, April the 4th, 2014. I'm David Knight, and we were talking just before the break about private prisons. And as I pointed out, I believe that private prisons are a pull, just as the Homeland Security and the federalization of the police being militarized is a push. We've got two things going on here, and there's a lot of corporate action pulling for the privatization of prisons, and there's a lot of very bad things going on as a result of that. They're guaranteed to have between 95 and 100% occupancy in these prisons. So that right there is a pull on the system to put people into prison. We just had a case in Arizona where a Republican representative slipped in at the last minute a $900,000 bonus to the private prison group, their GEO Group. They're one of the largest prison corporations in America, a very large corporation. And he said, I didn't see a problem giving them a small increase. If you don't treat people fairly, they won't treat you fairly in the future. Well, what could we read out of that? All but one Republican voted for the measure, but it got stripped out when people saw what was happening there. Now, this is also something that started with Ronald Reagan as part of the war on drugs, or as I like to call it, the war of drugs, because we got the government that is creating the system and then using it to attack our legal system as well as American citizens. But we've seen a lot of things happening with this private prison system, and we've seen this continuing on and on throughout the Democrat administrations. And there's an excellent article here from a fellow who is, I've got the name right here, Dave Hodge, editor of the Common Sense Show. He's in Arizona, and he says, this problem is not just my state's problem, it's your state's problem as well. It's in all of the states. And he points out that, as we mentioned before, there's over 2 million inmates in American prisons, 1 in 743 people. The U.S. has only 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. Well, where does this go to? He says, he ties us back to the Obama administration. And he says, of course, and we all know that Obama could stop this, but he does have some ties. He connects the corporate dots to a company called Vanguard. Actually, it's an investment fund, Vanguard Windsor II Fund, which Obama is involved in. But of course, it doesn't matter whether they're Democrats or Republicans. They are all there to work for the giant corporations, whether it's creating private prisons or whether it's doing a massive transfer of wealth from the American people to the insurance companies. You can always count on our politicians to step up to the plate. But he makes an interesting point. He talks about these private prisons, and he says this unholy practice is no less exploitative than the slave labor abuses of the past, and as in all forms of slavery, it is being fueled by profit. Mark my words, FEMA camps will be privatized as well. And he's got a case here that he makes in Arizona, but there's actually a case in Idaho, and they have taken over the private prison there after horrifying allegations of corruption, of theft, and of brutality. This is from a different corporation. This is from a Nashville, Tennessee-based Corrections Corporation of America. They were contracted to run the state prison in Idaho since 1997. Taxpayers currently pay that company $29 million a year to operate a 2,081-bed prison. They say the prison has been the subject of multiple lawsuits alleging rampant violence, understaffing, gang activity, and contract fraud. They acknowledged last year that they had falsified staff reports that they'd given to the state showing that they had thousands of hours. That's only part of it. Once they get people locked up, then they use them as slave labor. It kind of helps to take the bite out of losing business to the Chinese. You know, we can get our own slave labor here. And of course, once the people get into prison, they make it so difficult on them the outside, they have a 70% of the people come back. Can you do that with a restaurant? I don't think so. We're going to be right back with some more news, and we've got a review of Captain America coming up at the bottom of the hour. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight. I'll be your host today. We're also going to be joined at the bottom of the hour with Jakari Jackson, Leanne McAdoo, and Kit Daniels giving us their take on Captain America. Now, it's not going to have any spoilers in it. I'm going to try to make sure of that. I haven't seen it myself, so I don't want to know any spoilers about it. We do have a video review up. If you've already seen it, go take a look at our video review and get our take on where it fits in the liberty spectrum. We had many of the crew went to see it last night. I think it was an 8 o'clock show around the nation it premiered, and they put up a video afterwards giving their take on what they thought about the movie, because it's got a lot of political overtones. It's got a lot of connections to what we've been talking about today earlier. What about the Constitution? Should we have a constitutional convention to fix what's wrong with it? Or is what's wrong with government not the Constitution, but the people who swear an oath to it and then violate that oath? The people who break the law. If we have criminals in charge of the government, would it make any difference what laws we write? I mean, that's essentially what we're talking about when we talk about gun control, right? We say, well, let's criminalize gun control for the law-abiding citizens. The reality is that people who are criminals aren't really paying any attention to the laws right now, and that's what we have in our political class in Washington. We have a large group of criminals, and no constitutional convention is going to bring them in line. It's up to the people to get them back in line, and we can talk about how that could happen. But we're going to have that review at the bottom of the hour with the crew coming in here, the Captain America spoiler-free review. We also have coming up later in the show another special report from Alex Jones, this one on climate change. And while we're talking about climate change, we've seen a lot of intolerance with that, of course. We've seen in the UK calls from MPs calling for people to be censored and not allowed on network television to put in health claims if people are climate deniers. I mean, they basically are losing the argument on the science front, on the hard data. And so what they have to do is they have to censor people who are talking about that. Do they feel compelled to censor people who are talking about the earth being flat? No, because they don't have any compelling reason for that. And there's a lot of compelling data that shows that the earth is not flat. But they do have to censor people who deny their global warming narrative, the narrative that they're using to try to affect complete sociological change. They don't have the data to support that. As a matter of fact, the data conflicts directly with their climate models. Their climate models were predicated on a rapid rise in CO2 causing global warming. Well, we've had a very rapid rise in CO2, and it has done just the opposite. We don't see global warming in spite of them cooking the data and conspiring to cook the data in climate change, ClimateGate 1 and ClimateGate 2. We caught them in emails saying that they wanted to hide the decline in global temperatures. So there's a censorship there, there's an intolerance there, but we also see that that is being moved into other areas. We see that the political left is pushing against Hobby Lobby. We had Jon Stewart calling the Hobby Lobby store that was standing up for their First Amendment freedom of religion rights, this company that was owned by a family, started as a small business. He called them Jesus Christ Superstore and mocked them for resisting the fact that they were going to be forced to do something that violated their conscience. You know, Thomas Jefferson said the thing that he was most proud of in his life was the bill that he drafted for religious freedom. And you know what? If you lose your religious freedom, if you lose your First Amendment rights, then you're also going to lose your Fourth Amendment rights and your Fifth Amendment rights, and your Sixth Amendment rights. Oh, that's right. We already have lost those, haven't we? We need to start standing up for all of those. We're going to be right back with some more reports about what's going on with the police state, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and I'll be joined at the bottom of the hour with Jakari Jackson, Leanne McAdoo, and Kit Daniels are going to be giving us their spoiler-free take on Captain America. I know we have high hopes. I haven't seen it yet myself, so I'm going to make sure they don't give away anything. But I have high hopes that it's a story about returning to the moral foundations of our country. I think we've seen this country really go south, and especially since, let's say, World War II, there's been a public acceptance of corruption and of violating the laws we now see in Congress when the IRS can be used as a tool against political enemies openly. It's not that this hasn't been going on. It went on with Nixon. Of course, he was impeached for that. But it's been going on with all of these politicians, Democrat and Republican, and yet we see this come out in the open and stay there, and nothing is being done about it. That takes us morally to an all-new low level, the tolerance of the criminal behavior in Washington. And the cynicism that we see from people. I think people are one of the reasons I think that Captain America is so popular is because people are aching for some kind of moral foundation. They want to believe that there's somebody that is not going to be corrupted. And hopefully that's what this movie is about. Certainly looked like that from the trailers. But it also puts it in the current environment, I think, of a police state. So we'll be talking about that, hopefully not without, we'll do that without any spoilers. We're also going to be talking in the next hour about the shooting at Fort Hood, the reactions to it, what our government has done in the past about PTSD, because, of course, PTSD isn't really the issue here. He was not diagnosed with PTSD. He had not been in combat. So the issue is not necessarily PTSD, but the issue is SSRI drugs. Kit Daniels and Jakari Jackson went to the press conference at Fort Hood. They asked the question and they got the answer. That's currently linked up on Drudge Report. It's on Infowars.com about the common connection with all of these mass shootings being SSRI drugs. That is the current way that the government is treating depression and suicidal tendencies. And of course, it pushes people in just the opposite direction than you want them to go. It actually exacerbates those conditions under most, with many people. But our government has a history of other things. Not just as we had the EPA human testing scandal is now coming back because the EPA, a year after they got a judge to not put a temporary restraining order on them, they're coming back with kind of a mea culpa and saying that, well, we really do need to review these procedures to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Well, if there wasn't something wrong with it, why do they need to review the procedures? So that's come back into the stories. We covered that about a year and a half ago. It was Steve Malloy with junkscience.com who discovered that. It was American Tradition Institute that tried to stop it. But now it's come back and it's getting a lot of publicity coverage. But our government has been doing these kinds of human experimentations, not just on people, not just with the EPA, not just, of course, there's a long history with the Tuskegee Institute, as well as many other cases. We talked about this a couple of days ago. The CIA, under Operation Paperclip, brought a lot of Nazi scientists, a lot of Japanese scientists over. Of course, they always want to just talk about Wernher von Braun. There was a great parody piece, so we ought to lead in with that in the next thing if we could find it. I can't remember the guy's name, but it was something like, the rockets go up, the rockets come down, it's not my concern, says Wernher von Braun, right? If he can help us build rockets to do satellites, we don't care what he was helping the Nazis build rockets to do, right? Except that in the case of Operation Paperclip, most of the scientists that they brought back, that they took a very small number of them and held them up for a public display at the Nuremberg trial. But most of them that they could get their hands on, they brought back. And they were using them for biological and chemical testing on people. Very, very dangerous idea. Very morally bankrupt idea. There's a very good book written about the story of one of the scientists, one of the American scientists who work with him, Frank Olson. It's called A Horrible Mistake. He eventually realized what a horrible mistake it was to engage in these kind of experiments, and he was suicided. His sons are still trying to get justice from the federal government about that. That book has an amazing chronology about Operation Paperclip. A terrible mistake. Sorry, not a horrible mistake, a terrible mistake. Thank you for correcting me on that. Terrible mistake, the story of Frank Olson. And that book has an amazingly well-researched chronology of what was going on with him and gives you insights into what was happening with the human testing and experimentation. Very dark stuff. Unfortunately, at the beginning of the book, the author says that, well, that was a dark time in our history, and we're glad that we put that behind us. It hasn't been put behind us. It's still there. And our government is planning a much darker future. We're going to talk about what DARPA is planning for PTSD. And remember that it isn't just the veterans that the government is doing this to. If they're going to do it to the people who serve them, what do you think they're going to do to the people who are dissidents? What do you think they're going to do to the general public? You know, it's not just people who are returning vets with PTSD that are getting these SSRIs. They're giving them to children. They're getting children hooked on this stuff. We're seeing this happen across society. And what DARPA is looking at in the future to treat PTSD is something that they're going to be applying broadly. But we're going to look at not only that, and not only the history of what the VA was doing to people right after World War II, which is a very dark period of time where they were using lobotomies to returning World War II vets. That's right. You're having a problem because you were put in a Japanese prisoner of war camp for 3 years? Well, we're going to make your life hell here on Earth in America until we drive those memories out. I mean, that was the kind of treatment that they were giving them, which in retrospect is not just horrible and cruel, but just amazingly stupid. It's like putting leeches on somebody who is suffering from a disease. But as I said, we're going to talk about what DARPA wants to do in the future. But let's cover some of the other breaking news that's happening in this segment here. We've got Venezuela is enforcing fingerprint registry in order to buy groceries. This is a report that's up on Infowars right now. It is written by Daisy Luther, the organic prepper. What if you were forced to register in order to buy groceries? And what if, through that registration, the food you bought could be tracked and the quantities could be limited? Or maybe they could come back and confiscate what you've already bought. Well, that's exactly the plan in Venezuela right now. She writes, the AP reports an effort to crack down on hoarding. They're giving ID cards to families, and they will have to be presented before food can be purchased. And she says, you think that this isn't going to happen in America? Well, already the Obama administration has moved the pieces into place on the board to be able to appropriate supplies from anyone at any time, as we've covered in the past from Max Slavo of SHTF Plan. And, you know, that's what we see over and over again. We see the infrastructure of tyranny being put into place. The infrastructure that has been put into place with the NDAA, with Homeland Security, with the Viper teams, with TSA, with all of these different aspects. And now we see them actually starting to activate it. We see them breaking into people's homes. And, of course, this really goes back to the war on drugs, the SWAT team stuff, the idea that they would do no-knock raids, the idea that they could confiscate anything that they declared to be contraband illegally. During the war on drugs, they were putting charges against airplanes, against cash, not against the people. It was the U.S. versus Learjet, the U.S. versus $9,000 in cash. And the cash case, you had a black man who was in a nursery business, and he was flying from one place to another place to pick up a large truckload of things that he was going to drive back for his nursery business, and he had $9,000 in cash to pay for it. And they discovered this, and this is like 20 years ago during the war on drugs. They discovered the $9,000 of cash, and they just confiscated it. He had a perfectly good reason. They had no evidence that he was going to use it for drugs, no reason to believe that he was going to use it for drugs. But once they saw that he had the cash, they just took it and they created a case, the U.S. government versus $9,000 in cash. Another case where you had a guy who had ferried people for what he thought was just a business meeting in his private plane, his private jet. He ferried them from the U.S. to Canada. They met with some people, and he brought them back. They were just carrying briefcases. Well, it turns out that was part of a drug deal. What the feds did was they confiscated his plane. Now, they knew that he was not any part of the drug deal. They knew they couldn't prove that he had anything to do with it because they knew that he wasn't involved in it. He was just an innocent, essentially a taxi driver. They confiscated his plane, which is essentially confiscating his business. They destroyed him financially because of that. And, of course, they charged the plane with being an accessory to the drug transaction because they couldn't make the case stick against the man. They charged the inanimate object. Any government that is capable of that kind of Kafkaesque sophistry can come in and confiscate your food. And as he points out, think about the fact that now everything that you're buying is already being tracked with these rewards programs, right? The government could go back in and pull that information up if they wanted to. In more news, we see that the IMF is warning that we're going to have global stagnation if Ukraine is not bailed out. You didn't realize that that was going to create a global collapse if we didn't bail out the Ukraine, did you? Yes, that's the baloney that Christine Lagarde is feeding everybody. This is a story from Kurt Nemo that was up yesterday, came up late yesterday. Christine Lagarde has recycled the bankster mantra that the globalists pushed for a bailout of the Ukraine. She says geopolitical tensions in the Ukraine could cloud the global economic future. Well, that sounds bad. And it could have broader spillover implications. That's right. The Ukraine now is going to take down the entire world economy if the bankers don't bail them out. And, of course, who's going to pay for that? The poor people of the Ukraine. As he points out in the article, she didn't mention that the IMF package what it'll do to the average Ukrainian. It's going to be an austerity program like they've seen in Italy and elsewhere, and people are rebelling to the point of secession in Italy over the austerity programs that were imposed by globalist bankers. We're going to be back with more news, and we're going to have a review of Captain America at the bottom of the hour with the Infowars staff. Stay tuned. We'll be the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, your host, and I'm going to be joined in the next segment with the Infowars crew, and they're going to have a review for you of Captain America. It brought up some real interesting questions as we looked at the trailer. I think it's probably one of the most anticipated movies of the year. We are not going to spoil it for you. I haven't seen it myself, but I do want to kind of I'm curious as to how this fits in the liberty spectrum. Now, I was just going over some economic news before we went to the break, and there's a couple of other pieces here I want to cover with you. Shocking facts about the deindustrialization of America that everyone should know. This is from Infowars.com today. It's an article by Michael Snyder, and he's pointing out what triggered this article is the fact that the U.S. trade deficit jumped in February. Climbed to the highest level in 5 months in February. It was 7.7% higher than in January. This is money that is bleeding out of America. As he points out in the opening statement, he said, how long can America continue to burn up wealth? How long can this nation continue to consume far more wealth than it produces? And he goes through in the article, he says, we sold $122 billion worth of stuff to China. It sounds like a lot, but we bought from them $440 billion worth of things. And he shows the trade deficit with just China going from 1990 until currently, where it is now $318 billion trade deficit with China. $318 billion trade deficit. That's larger than the gross domestic product of many, many countries. And he says it's been estimated that the U.S. economy loses approximately 9,000 jobs for every $1 billion of goods that are imported from overseas. And one last statistic I'll give you. He says since 2001, the United States has lost more than 56,000 manufacturing jobs. Well, it's not just from attacks abroad, from trade deficits with other countries like China that we are being bled to death. We're also being bled to death with mandates from our federal government. Somebody has to pay for these Obamacare mandates. It's going to be coming out of the pockets of the people who are buying insurance or their employers who are going to be buying insurance for them. And it is, as we pointed out over and over again, it is a huge increase. Anywhere up to 5 times people are seeing their insurance policies go up. Now we learn from the article from National Journal that 15 to 20% of the people aren't paying their Obamacare premiums. That's news from Blue Cross Blue Shield, one of the biggest players in Obama's exchanges. They're saying that 15 to 20% of the new customers aren't paying for their first premiums, which means that they're not actually covered. So even if we can believe these figures that the Obama administration is putting out, and there's a lot of reason not to believe anything they say, because we've seen not just the Obama administration, but every administration always puts out unemployment figures. They will put them out one quarter, and then they'll revise them the next quarter, and they're constantly changing these things to make the current situation always look better. So they revise it, the bad news, they revise upward from earlier periods so they can make current stuff look better. And of course, he's taken it to all new levels. He's not just talking about the creation of jobs, which the federal government doesn't create jobs. Okay, private sectors, individuals create jobs. All they do is create bureaucracies, which are a drain on the productive part of the economy. But he's taken it to a new level where he says these are jobs saved. Now, you can just make up any number you want to put in that. So when we see that kind of nonsense coming out of the federal government, when they start talking to us about how many people have signed up for Obamacare, can we really trust that? Now, the government has given us the number that it's about 7 million people that have signed up. But if you apply this across the board, because Blue Cross Blue Shield is not located in any one particular area, they're pretty much across the United States. So their figures are likely to be pretty much the experience across the country. So if 15 to 20% of the people are not paying their premiums, which means that they're not insured, that would take, even if you go with Obama's number of 7 million people, that would take it down to about 6 million people that they say are covered. Out of about 350 million, is that something that we should be excited about? 2% coverage? Is that something that is, is really great news? Now, one last bit of news before we go to the break here. There was a great piece from Andrew Sullivan, dish.andrewsullivan.com. He called it The Hounding of a Heretic. And he talks about how homosexuals lobbied to get a Mozilla executive fired. He said the guy who had the gall to express his First Amendment rights and favor Proposition 8 in California by donating $1,000 has just been scalped by some gay activists. He says, will he now be forced to walk through the streets in shame? If this is the gay rights movement today, hounding our opponents with a fanaticism more like the religious right than anyone else, then count me out. Good for Andrew Sullivan. That's what we've been trying to say. We're going to be right back with a review of Captain America. The Infowars crew saw it last night. They're going to tell you what they thought. No spoilers, so stay tuned. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. And you just heard in that break, defending the Republic against enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, I think that's what the Captain America movie is about. At least that's what the trailer was about. I haven't seen the film myself, but a lot of the Infowars crew went to see it last night, and we've got reports from them. We've got Jakari Jackson, Kit Daniels, and Leanne McAdoo are going to give us their take on it. And no spoilers, because I know, just like you, I haven't seen it. I don't want to know anything.
Guys in this movie, David. I was joking. The Hulk's not in it.
Okay. All right. So guys, on a scale of 1776 to 1984, where does this fit?
I think it's closer to 1776.
If we're going to be technical, I'd say 1787.
Okay, all right. Just before the Constitution was ratified. Okay, we're on to the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, it's a very good movie. We'll try to be as vague as far as the plot details, but to talk about the setup in the film, you have S.H.I.E.L.D., which is pretty much DHS on the super soldier serum, right? Mm-hmm. So it's this big arms domestic buildup, because in the real world, we have DHS, they're buying the bullets, they have the paper targets, they have TSA agents carrying guns now, they have Viper teams. In the movie, S.H.I.E.L.D. represents pretty much DHS in a more financially lucrative time. They have the arms and all the other things that they need. So that's very concerning to me, and I hope people who can understand our current situation as far as DHS and domestic arms can understand the parallel in the movie. When you give this much power, this much finance and resource to a particular agency to carry out a task, you have to be wary of the fact that not everybody in that organization has your best interest in heart.
So like the real world, you've got the military-industrial complex on steroids. You've got a super soldier program, which is a real-world thing. I mean, we've got coming up later in the program, I'm going to talk about the BRAIN initiative. That's actually an acronym. BRAIN is actually an acronym, and of course, Obama has doubled down on that budget, and it involves DARPA, and DARPA also has a real-life super soldier program, don't they?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very, very scary stuff. And, of course, this is something that's been going on for a long time. This is something that we were warned about by Eisenhower with the military-industrial complex, that you would have not only the people who are building the weapons involved in this incestuous relationship with the government, but it would subsume all scientific research as well, right?
Yeah, the movie reminded me of a lot of neoconservative think tanks like the Project for a New American Century, where they pretty much advocated order out of chaos, which is often order out of artificial chaos.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of allusions to that in the film, and a lot of allusions to eliminating threats before they become threats, which we also see in a lot of Philip K. Dick books with pre-crime, so on and so forth.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, very much so.
And we see, they do the kind of data mining thing that we have to spy on you to keep you safe, right? So they're looking at your internet searches, they're tapping your phones. We have the reports out of the phone tapping, all this stuff going on. And you see this not just in the new film, but you saw it also in the Avengers, right? Because, the threat's out. So we're going to tap everybody's phone. We're going to be looking in the traffic cameras. And it's more of the same in the new film.
And we also saw this in 2002 in the New York Times with the article on total information awareness, where the Department of Defense wanted to take every American's personal records, travel, finance, criminal, education, so on and so forth, even maybe your library books you checked out, in order to predict your future behavior and create a risk profile on you. So they could say, well, maybe this behavior is suspicious.
Well, as we've pointed out before, metadata can actually be more useful for that than listening to your phone conversations or reading your emails, because they can look at that metadata and they can predict where you're going to be in the next 24 hours more accurately than you can. And at the time, that was just about a month or so ago, Paul Joseph Watson pointed out that there was a Homeland Security bid for a system that was going to essentially record license plates, the license plate database. And the next day, they took that down after it got the publicity. But concurrently with that, you've got IBM and Cisco working together to create a literal information highway where they're going to provide social media to you as you're driving down the road. It's going to be they're going to be providing in the roadbed, internet for you, but they're also going to be watching you. They're going to be recording your license plate information, all that sort of thing. So that really is where they are. So I guess the question with the movie is, Do they present that as a positive thing?
No, absolutely not.
And that's what I thought was so refreshing about this movie. Not just this one, but we saw it also in somewhat of the Avengers and also in Iron Man 3, which was a terrible movie. But they had the good premise of they were talking about the false flag. They were talking about the fall guy, your puppets, you know, who are being controlled by the big boys. And Marvel's moving in that direction, so I do definitely give them credit for that. I'm not a big fan of all things Disney, but I at least give them credit for their movies as far as being pro-liberty. Because Captain America, he doesn't represent the government. He represents the American people, right? So he's a real all-American guy. He says, you know, I went out there and I fought for freedom. What you guys are doing here is fear. And he says that in the trailer to Samuel L. Jackson, Nick Fury. He says, I want people to be free. I don't want this world we have to be in fear.
And I know he's a fictional character, but Captain America came out of the greatest generation. And he was educated under the Constitution and Bill of Rights. I remember, I think it was in 1928, there was a Department of Army manual that pointed out that our country is a republic, not a democracy. That is something that's not taught in any public education center at all in America anymore.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to play that trailer, give people a sense of it if they haven't heard it. And we also want to talk to Leanne McAdoo and get her take on it. We'll have to switch out Kit because we've got two microphones here. Was there anything else you want to say, Kit, before we switch out?
Well, right before the movie, they're doing a little trivia night at the Draft House where they were pulling someone out of the audience of the theater and asking them questions. And the questions were like, well, who was the second president? When was the Constitution ratified? So on and so forth. None of the people were getting any of the questions correct.
Really?
So I was thinking about at the end of the movie that in order for all of us to get out of this mess that we're in, we all have to be Captain America. We all have to be superheroes in an intellectual debate, in an information war.
That's right.
So we got to transform from being clueless about basic trivia on the foundation of our country to becoming Captain America.
That's right. And we're not going to have a superhero get elected as president or anything else is going to get us out of this mess. We have to do it ourselves.
Yeah, it's all grassroots.
Exactly.
That's something I learned from the Ron Paul movement. It's all grassroots.
And it's knowing what your rights are and understanding, as you pointed out, we have a republic, not a democracy, but we also have a constitution that guarantees rights that transcend the government. The Constitution was there to say, you know what, these rights are already in place. You can't go beyond these certain restrictions. And they don't give us our rights. So many people think that the Constitution gives us our rights, and they don't. And so we need to understand that I believe that nothing can come out of a constitutional convention except bad stuff.
And what I mentioned yesterday on the show that applies here is that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, they didn't even debate on hardly anything on the Bill of Rights because they all agreed with them. Basically, James Madison wrote truisms that they all agreed with.
Yes, yes. Very different from today. Let's take a look at this clip, and then we're going to bring in Leanne McAdoo and get her take on this. Doesn't necessarily make for great radio, so we're going to come back and get Leanne McAdoo's take on this. We've been talking to Jakari Jackson and Kit Daniels. The crew went to see Captain America last night. Leanne, tell us your take on it without any spoilers, because I haven't seen it, and a lot of people that are listening haven't seen it because it just premiered last night, 1 or 2 shows nationwide. Really, today is the big premiere day.
Yeah, Kid, I see you've been taking your super female vitality there.
Yeah, well, it's, for me, it was, I mean, great visually. It was very entertaining, but it's got so much subliminal messages there for people that might not read Infowars every day. They are going to be introduced to this, to what's going on, because basically I feel like the writers read Infowars and just put this movie together. I mean, all of the themes are there, and it's basically like, it seems futuristic, but it's America. It's the world today. These are the globalists. This is what's happening. And Kit mentioned this in the review, that they kind of set it up where it's the surveillance state it's already there. There's no question. How did the world get like this? How did the police state become like this? How did this all, how did we get to where we are? It is. And there's no question of how did this world become what it has become. And so that's something that we all need to sort of say, well, why are we just kind of being coaxed into this reality? Like, this is what's going to happen. You've just got to accept it. And basically it was just so telling to me that the globalists that were kind of in charge of everything, they use so much doublespeak in the movie. And for that to just expose people to doublespeak and how someone can say something about how they're trying to build a better world right? And in order to build a better world, which is their version of better, they've got to tear down the current world. And so they're going to be exposed to just how they're tearing down the world and creating chaos, and how they're creating the chaos.
Well, you touched on something I think is very important, and that is, we can give people facts, we can give them the news, we can give them documentaries, and documentaries are very, very compelling because they can go very in-depth into a story. And there's also a visceral component of that, because as part of a documentary, you're going to see video clips, you're going to hear about people's personal experiences. It's going to personalize it instead of it just being a policy statement. Mm-hmm. But when we have a work of fiction like this, and I think that's what everybody wanted to know, as I asked Kit, actually it was my son who came up with that, on a scale of 1776 to 1984, where does it fall? We want to know, is this going to resonate with us viscerally? Is it going to present the real problems that we face in this country with the police state, with the surveillance state?
I think it definitely does. As far as, a movie to take your kids to, I think the first one's probably more visually appealing to a child, but this one, if you're up on the facts and you know what's going on in the real world, you can draw these comparisons very similar. Used to talk about DHS being S.H.I.E.L.D. and many other comparisons I won't go into right now because I don't want to spoil the movie, but there's a lot of real stuff being mentioned, or at least things that you can parallel pretty closely to real world events and real world problems going on in this film.
Yeah, that's interesting. I saw a review from a couple of days ago on NPR. Now, I'm just kind of wondering, from somebody that's seen it now, their take on it, it was titled Captain America on the Potomac. And I'm just wondering if this is kind of from their DC-centric perspective or what. Let me just read you a little section of this. They say the Triskelion, I guess is the big building, isn't merely on the beautiful Potomac, but in it, jutting out to dangle over the water, incidentally and ironically obliterating a fair amount of actual landscape. They talk about how the Potomac area and the Washington, D.C. area is kind of put out there pastorally in the film. And D.C. looks like it's organic. And here you've got this skyscraper police state icon that is kind of jutting out into it. Did that come across to you that way? Or is that really kind of their perspective on it? I was curious.
I mean, it is a very large building. And like I said, D.C. is the backdrop. So I wouldn't say that's an unfair criticism of the film. But I don't think that's too much what the film's actually about. Well,
they were actually saying, I think, their take on it, they were kind of surprised that in the film, they saw, because it was set in D.C., they kind of saw D.C. as representative of America.
Well,
and that's not typically the case.
You want to say that that's the level of corruption and, deception that's actually going on, and just, tying it into reality right now. It's a great thing for people to, if you are a policeman or, working for the CIA or whatever, maybe you're not a bad guy, but look to your right, look to your left. You don't know what agenda these guys have because it's all compartmentalized, and you don't know what the people who are working behind the scenes, what their big agenda is, what they're working towards.
I think one of the things that makes Captain America so compelling to everybody is that for the longest period of time we've seen, in an effort to try to make protagonists more believable, they give them elements of darkness, and now it's become so bad that we see the heroes of many movies today are much worse than the villains of 20, 30 years ago, certainly of the villains in the movies that I was watching as a kid. And so when we see Captain America, who is this guy who has this straight moral foundation, he's got a solid moral foundation, he knows what he believes, he's going to stand on it, he's going to do what he believes is right. And we see that kind of contrasted with Tony Stark, who's pretty much a representative of current society, the military-industrial complex, amoral, anything for money, and it's like, I can spend. Every once in a while he does something altruistically, but he has to kind of be pulled into it, I think that's the thing about Captain America that really stood out in the first one, that straight-up earnestness.
Yeah, I'd say the only real criticism I would have of the film is that everybody, your crooked people, they weren't official government politicians. They're kind of all these offshoots. So they didn't really touch on the real political corruption that could or, would happen in the real world. I think there's like one crooked senator, but by and large, they don't talk about, how does the president feel about this? Or how does Congress feel about all these things? It's more of this kind of shadow DHS type group.
I see. So it's kind of they're kind of giving a pass to the politicians in a sense, letting them off the hook a little bit.
Well, they also had, bringing it all in, there was just so many different themes in this movie, and they had, the singularity was a big part of this movie, and how they were working toward that as well. They pulled in Operation Paperclip, kind of tied that into how that was working for the New World Order. There was Chris saw some Benghazi-esque scenes there.
Yeah, we don't want to elaborate too much on that, but there's a situation that happens in the film that you can mirror towards type of a Benghazi situation.
Well, certainly the super soldier, as we mentioned at the beginning of the discussion with Kit Daniels in here, the super soldier and what DARPA is working on, that is not really science fiction anymore. I mean, that is really the basis of their research, and it's very troubling to me to see that you've got DARPA, which has a research budget that is bigger than the military spending of most countries. And what they are involved in, it's almost like they go in and they take any new technology, whether it is electronics or whether it's biological, everything that they do, they always seem to go in and find the darkest way that it could be applied. The most perverse way that the technology could be, because any technology is nothing but a tool. It can be used for good or it can be used for evil, except DARPA always looks for the most evil application of it.
About using the super soldier for good or for evil. You remember in the first Captain America film that he didn't originally want to accept Rogers, not just because of his physical stature, but because there was another guy who thought it was more police state line. He's like, so-and-so is a soldier. He's going to do what we tell him. He's going to kill who we tell him to kill and do what we tell him to do. And as you see, not only in the last movie, but in the new movie, Captain America, he has that line. He says, I'm going out there to keep people safe. I'm not doing your black ops. I'm not doing all this stuff. I'm here to be a soldier, not a spy.
That's right. In the very first movie, the scientist who was the chief scientist and had a say-so, he picked him because he had moral character. That's the thing that is going to win this, is moral backbone. And it makes everybody into a super soldier. Great review. Thank you so much for filling us in on that. And you didn't give anything away. I got to say, I still want to see it. I think everybody's going to see this movie. All right, we'll be right back.
My name is Dell, and I live in El Cajon, California.
We just had a great review of the Captain America movie that premiered in limited run last night. It's going to be, actually today is when it's going to be played. It was just a couple of runnings last night. I think midnight showings and 8 o'clock showings across the country. Leanne McAdoo, Jakari Jackson, and Kit Daniels gave us a great review without spoiling anything. But before I go into some more news, I want to tell you that this hour of the Alex Jones Show has been brought to you by MyPatriotSupply.com. Folks, we know the globalists are digging in. The day is coming when America as we know and love it will be a distant memory. But patriots everywhere are getting prepared, and they're doing it with one of my favorite companies, MyPatriotSupply.com. MyPatriotSupply.com offers high-quality survival gear and is the home of the Patriot Pantry line of emergency food storage. The food's delicious, easy to prepare, put together with GMO-free crops, and it's storable for 25 years. And My Patriot Supply has developed space-saving and secure food storage bins, unlike the flimsy plastic pails you find almost everywhere else. Visit MyPatriotSupply.com/Alex today for special offers. That's MyPatriotSupply.com/Alex. The globalists are counting on you to be unprepared. Fight back. Get prepared at MyPatriotSupply.com/Alex today. Now, just before the break, we were talking about the intolerance of society and how we see this coming out. There's an article on Infowars. If you don't conform, the thought Nazis will get you. And we were talking just before they came in for the review of Captain America, before the Infowars crew came in, we were talking about the intolerance that we're seeing rising in this country. Now, in this article that's up on Infowars.com, Michael Snyder points out that this guy that was just driven out of Mozilla, the CEO who was driven out of there, was driven out because he supported Proposition 8. That's the proposition in California that supported traditional marriage. And it doesn't matter, he points out, that it was passed by 52% of the voters. It doesn't matter that he gave $1,000 to it, and it doesn't matter that he did things like inventing the programming language JavaScript and that he co-founded Mozilla. Instead, they pushed him out. And I was reading just a brief quote. I want to read a little bit more of this quote from Andrew Sullivan. It's on his website, dish.andrewsullivan.com. And he said what we really need to have said by both sides on this debate on so many things. I've seen so much intolerance from the left when it comes to religion or when it comes to tolerance of religion. They can be incredibly intolerant. in the name of tolerance. That's the irony of it. That's what's so bad about it. And that's what Andrew Sullivan points out here. He says, will this fellow who's just been pushed out of Mozilla, will he be forced now to walk through the streets in shame? Why not put him in stocks? He said, this whole episode disgusts me, as it should disgust anyone interested in a tolerant and diverse society. If this is the gay rights movement today, hounding our opponents with a fanaticism more like the religious right than anyone else, then count me out. If we are about intimidating the free speech of others, we are no better than the anti-gay bullies who came before us. And we have seen that not just about homosexual marriage. We've also seen that about exercising your religious freedom and not participating in the murder of infants. We have a Supreme Court case that's been argued last week before the Supreme Court. They're currently deciding on it. That's the case, of course, of Hobby Lobby and another company, Conestoga Furniture or something like that. It's a smaller company. People are arguing that they don't lose their First Amendment protection of religious freedom just because they create a company, and they cannot be compelled to pay for abortions. We also saw this another story from Don Salazar, boy forced to stop reading the Bible in an after-school program. But in this case, the ACLU is defending him, not attacking religious freedom. That's good news. We've seen that the Army is no longer going to use the Southern Poverty Law Center. That's good news. I'm sorry, not the Army, the FBI. So maybe things are starting to change. We're going to be right back with some more news. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight. I'll be your host today, and we've got a lot of news coming up. We've got Alex Jones who's going to be joining us at the bottom of the hour with a special report on climate change. Yeah, that's part of the intolerance that we've seen. We were just talking about how there is so much intolerance towards religious freedom. And you know what, folks? Even if you're an atheist, you need to support religious freedom, just like you need to support other people's freedom of speech. Those two are connected together in the First Amendment for good reason. If you're going to attack religious freedom, you're going to lose free speech as well. So don't use your free speech to attack religious freedom. Try to be tolerant. And being tolerant doesn't mean that you coerce other people into recognizing and subsidizing things like homosexual marriage. You can still have tolerance where people are allowed to live their lives. And maybe what we should do is what Ron Paul said, and that is get the government out of the marriage business. You know, they weren't always there. In the 1700s, it was the purview of the churches. They kept records of births, of deaths, of marriages. What happened was it just kind of fell back into the purview of the government because they had people who were going from one town to the other, having multiple wives. There were several high-profile cases. As many people pointed out, bad law is predicated on bad cases. And what they did at that time, they decided that they were going to centralize record keeping. That's how we got into the situation where government defined what marriage is. And many conservatives might push back and say, but I like the traditional definition that we've had of marriages. And that's fine. Push for that. Persuade people of that. Government is not the only tool that you've got. And whether you're a conservative Christian or whether you're an atheist, you need to start looking at tools that are not only non-coercive but persuasive. But understand that government is not the proper way to change society. If you've got a hammer, if that's the only tool that you've got, then everything looks like a nail, as they've said. And unfortunately, to many people, whether they're conservatives or liberals, the only hammer they think they've got, the only tool they've got is a hammer, the government, and they hammer everybody with it. We need to try to persuade people, especially the Christians, need to try to persuade and not coerce people. And basically, we're not trying to coerce people. We're not going around arresting people who are living their lives in their homes because they're engaged in homosexual activity. There was a time when that did happen. That is not what's happening now. But now we have the opposite effect that is taking place. Now we have people who are getting sued because they don't want to participate in a homosexual wedding, for example, as a photographer, as somebody who is providing services or whatever. We need to support people's ability to make choices. That's what this is all about. And we see a lot of intolerance in a lot of different areas about that, whether it is the government forcing people to provide abortion coverage in their companies, or whether it's a child who is trying to have the freedom to read his Bible during a study hall in school. We see a tremendous amount of intolerance. We need to understand what Voltaire said. He said, I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to death your right to say that. And we don't see that from too many people. But I read a great quote from Andrew Sullivan in the last segment where he was very upset about what just happened with the Mozilla executive who was shoved out because he had supported Proposition 8 for traditional marriage. Again, I think the way to do this is to roll this back and not allow the government to have the say-so. Allow people to do free association. Allow people to make the choice as to whether or not they want to, in their business, to subsidize what kind of relationships, whether they want to subsidize marriages at all, whether they're homosexual or heterosexual. They should be able to make that determination instead of having it forced upon them. The first time I ever heard about homosexual marriage was when I was taking a libertarian candidate around. And he was asked that question, and his answer to that was exactly right. He says, you're trying to use government to force people to subsidize something they would not normally do or to force them to do it through the government. I don't think that's the libertarian position. It wasn't 20 years ago. I don't think it should be today. We're going to be right back. We've got some breaking news about real-life super soldiers and the way our government treats its soldiers. Stay tuned. We're going to have that information right after the break.
Why does the United States spend the largest...
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, your host today, and there is a bad moon rising. If you're aware of the Captain America story, as you probably saw the first movie, and it's probably the most anticipated movie of this year, opened last night for a couple of showings across the country. Today is really kind of the official rollout date. And of course, that is predicated on the idea of the super soldier. The super soldier is not a science fiction idea anymore. This is something that the government is heavily investing in. But I want to take this Fort Hood shooting that happened this week and the responses to it and look at that as well as the way our government has treated veterans in the past, the way they're treating them now, and what they are proposing, what DARPA is proposing to do to military with PTSD in the future. And as we get to that, we're going to look at DARPA's idea for their future soldier, for their biotech soldier, for their super soldier. Now, as this shooting happened, a lot of people were talking about PTSD. And of course, he was not diagnosed with PTSD. He was not in battle. He did have a gun in an area that had been declared a gun-free zone during the Clinton administration, and has been left that way throughout subsequent Republican administration. And of course, Obama is not changing that either. It shows the bankruptcy of the idea that here are people that we're going to hand not only sidearms to, but every kind of firearm, rocket launchers, tanks, you name it, missiles, but they cannot be allowed to have firearms to protect themselves, to protect others. That's absolute nonsense. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, that's the same kind of thinking that harasses airline pilots and tries to confiscate their nail clippers in the name of making the plane safe from terrorism. Okay, if you're going to take away the nail clippers from the pilots, if you're going to take away the sidearms from the soldiers on the base, that's just idiotic. Just idiotic. If the person's a problem, they don't need to be an airline pilot or a soldier. But if they're there, they've already got the tools to do far more damage than what you're talking about taking away from them. Now, the thing that concerned me about this was as I heard a lot of conservative people saying that we need to get that these military bases, and this is a story that had a lot of local coverage here in the Austin area, as well as it being a national story because Fort Hood is not that far away. It's just a couple of hours away from Austin. And so there was a lot of talk on local talk radio about it. And as I was driving in the other day, I heard these guys talking about it and made the comment, one of them made the comment, Fort Hood is just filled with crazy people. And the other guy, who was kind of a conservative, kind of pulled back and said, you can't say that. Not because he didn't think they were crazy, but because he wanted to find some more politically correct term to use. Look, this is the kind of trap that is the most dangerous kind of trap for gun control. And I've seen some people in the NRA say that we need to have psychological evaluation and permission from the government in order for anybody to have guns. This is something that's not going to just affect veterans. This is something that's going to affect everybody. The way that tyrannies in the 20th century preferred to get rid of dissidents, to get rid of any opposition, was to declare them as crazy. It's very easy to declare somebody insane. It's very difficult to prove that you are sane, especially when somebody has said that you're insane. Remember the movie One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest? Remember, Jack Nicholson came in pretending to be insane so that he could get out of the ordinary prison. He thought it was going to be a cakewalk in sanatorium, okay? And he runs into a test of wills with Nurse Ratched. And eventually that ends. Sorry, spoiler alert. I'm sure most of you have seen it. It's one to go back and look at again. But it ends with a lobotomy. And that pretty much discredited the idea of lobotomy. Dramatic narratives can be very, very effective in terms of waking people up. Now, you need to be able to step in with the facts afterwards, but it's that kind of visceral connection really does wake people up. And that's why we spent time talking about Captain America, because it addresses some fundamental core issues that we need to address right now in this country. And I want to go back and look at the history of the way veterans have been treated in this country, especially some who went through some of the most horrendous conditions of World War II, being interred in Japanese prisoner of war camps for years. When they came back, they were deeply troubled psychologically. And they took them into the VA, and there was an excellent series that was done by Michael M. Phillips for the Wall Street Journal back in December of 2013. I think the guy deserves a Pulitzer Prize for this. Great research, great story. What he found was that the VA, the U.S. government, lobotomized over 2,000 soldiers after World War II. Listen to this particular account. There you see on the screen is one fellow that they talked to. His name is Roman Tritz. And he says, Roman Tritz's memories of the past 6 decades are blurred by age and delusion. But one thing he remembers clearly is the fight he put up the day the orderlies came for him. He said, they got the notion they were going to come and give me a lobotomy. To hell with them. The orderlies at the Veterans Hospital pinned him to the floor, he recalls. He fought so hard they eventually gave up. But the orderlies came for him again on Wednesday, July 1st, 1953, a few weeks before his 30th birthday. The U.S. government lobotomized about 2,000 mentally ill veterans and likely hundreds more, he points out. He said the VA performed the brain-altering operations on former servicemen that it had diagnosed as depressives or psychotics or schizophrenics. And they occasionally did it to people they identified as homosexuals. Now, Mr. Tritz, the guy that you just saw up there, if you're watching this on the screen, he's now 90 years old. And as he was being interviewed, he said, it isn't so good up here, he said, as he pointed to his head, tapped his head. The VA's use of lobotomy, in which doctors severed connections between parts of the brain that were then thought to control emotion, was known in medical circles in the late 1940s and early 1950s, is occasionally cited in medical texts, but the VA's practices were never publicized. They were long ago pulled out of the public's view. Now, here's what he underwent before they gave him the lobotomy. He underwent 28 rounds of electroshock therapy, and they point out in the article, this is a common treatment that sometimes caused convulsions that were so jarring that they broke patients' bones. Can you imagine that? This poor fellow had spent 3 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. He was so physically and psychologically damaged by that they put him in a hospital. And this is what our government did to this fellow who fought for them when he came back. You talk about betrayal, about a World War II vets, about Captain America, that type of thing. And we're going to talk about the super soldier thing coming up here. But they gave him electroshock therapy that sometimes caused convulsions so bad that it broke patients' bones. Then, to stimulate patients' nerves, hospital staff also commonly sprayed veterans with powerful jets of alternating hot and cold water, show the archives. This particular fellow, Mr. Tritz, got 66 treatments of high-pressure water sprays that they called the Scotch douche and the needle shower. His medical records show that. Now, that's what they did to veterans back then. And, of course, this is they also have a story of many, many veterans and things that happened to them. What are they doing today? Well, today they're giving them SSRI drugs. And the SSRI drugs do the same thing to veterans that they do to people who are not in the military. They make them suicidal. They exacerbate, in many cases, the medical conditions that they're trying to treat. They make people suicidal. They make them homicidal. They have them sleepwalking where they don't know what they're doing, and they take actions that they are not aware of. Where are we going with this? Well, Obama has just doubled down on funding for something they call the BRAIN Initiative. Now, the government always loves to do these acronyms. They come up with the acronym and then they fill it in. You know, if you don't like the government, they accuse you of being odd, ODD. That's oppositional defiant disorder. Well, in this particular case, BRAIN stands for Brain Research through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies. So that's their BRAIN. And what they are planning to do is to develop with DARPA and the National Institute of Health a toolbox of technologies to map the brain's circuitry, to measure activity in brain circuits, to probe how these circuits lead to unique human cognition and behavior. Now, of course, DARPA has said that they want to use this as a way to treat PTSD. They believe that they can go in and selectively delete memories, that they can go in and give you memories that did not previously exist. And this is the stuff that we have seen before in science fiction, isn't it? Philip K. Dick's Total Recall, where they give people memories that they didn't have before, playing with people's comprehension of reality, playing with their memories. If they're going to do this in a benevolent way to soldiers, could not they do it in a malevolent way to dissidents, to also the soldiers themselves? Maybe giving them a memory of shooting Osama bin Laden that they really didn't happen, or whatever. It's a very troubling thing to see the government doing this, and it's a very troubling thing to see DARPA involved in this. DARPA is always, as we pointed out, as we were talking about before, when we were talking about Captain America, it seems like they are always involved in the worst and the darkest ways of applying technology. All technology is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used in a good way or it can be used in a bad way. You can take a hammer and you can use it to drive a nail into a board, or you can take a hammer and you can kill people with it. DARPA takes the hammers and they hit people in the head with it. That's what they are about. And that's what we're seeing. The funding is being doubled down on that. And it's a very disturbing thing to see them moving in that direction. But there's an even more disturbing story about DARPA. This is one that we linked to on Infowars yesterday. It's actually a story from a place called IO9. And they talk about DARPA's new biotech division wants to create a transhuman future. I'm going to have to return with that right after the break. But, you know, we've talked about how frightening these robots that we see DARPA developing are. We see them developing robots that can run faster than humans. And we see them developing robots that can do things with superhuman strength, but they're looking to create flesh and blood robots. That's the most disturbing thing. And we're going to have that information right after the break. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight. I'll be your host today, but we're going to be joined at the bottom of the hour with Alex Jones' special report on climate change. So stay tuned. Don't miss that. Now, just before the break, we were talking about the sad history of the American VA Association, the Veterans Administration, and the way they treated returning World War II vets, giving many of the ones who had the greatest problems, giving them shock treatment, violent shock treatment, hitting them with hot and cold jets of water, and then ultimately giving them lobotomies. What are they doing today? They're doing that in a much more subtle, much more high-tech way. They're doing it with SSRI drugs, and they're doing that to a lot of people in society. And so we should look very carefully at future treatments that they're planning. And, of course, DARPA is looking to, as they say, they're doing brain research because they just want to help us. They just want to help soldiers who have PTSD. And so they're going to selectively be able to remove memories or to implant new memories of things that you never did. That's what DARPA is trying to do. And they're trying to do a lot besides that. We've reported, and we just showed you a picture up there if you're watching, a picture of the robots that are being developed by DARPA. And of course, when they develop these robots, they say, well, this is all so that we can use them to help in the Fukushima disaster. Well, if they're so concerned about the Fukushima disaster, then maybe the Defense Department shouldn't have sent the sailors on the USS Reagan into dangerous territory and left them there for a couple of days. There's a mass of soldiers, I guess it's been 3 years now, that are coming down with cancer already because of that treatment. But, of course, the robots are not there to attack you. It's not part of some new kind of real-world realization of Terminator. No, they're there to protect us all from Fukushima. And the new super soldiers that they're creating and the brain projects where they want to remove some memories and selectively implant others, that's not going to be used against dissidents. That's not going to be used against the general population. That's just to help some selected soldiers who are struggling with PTSD. And of course, there is a massive brain research project that's being conducted internationally, and just in the U.S., it's called the Brain Initiative, and Obama just doubled the funding for that. But as we were going to break, I was just starting to talk about this article that was linked on Infowars. DARPA's new biotech division wants to create a transhuman future. Yes, that's right. You think the super soldier program in Captain America is science fiction? It is much, much worse than that. Now, what they're talking about is basically making human robots. That's where it's all headed. But they point out, they put a nice spin on it in this report, because this is kind of the people who wrote this, even though they're giving you a lot of links, a lot of data, it's really kind of more of a sci-fi website, more of a popular science type of website. They're not going to question the ethics of what could be done, and that's what's really the problem. So often we have scientists who do not question the ethics of what they're going to be doing. We see a lot of movie themes where you have soldiers who were, or police officers who were brought into some kind of a criminal operation that the government is doing, or that criminal elements within the government are doing, and they aren't really fully aware of how they're being used. Or you have stories that talk about the false narratives that got us into the Iraq War and how soldiers there were just trying to do the right thing. They didn't realize how they were being used. But we have only had, as far as I know, recently, there's only been one movie, it's one of the Bourne movies, where you actually had a scientist kind of back off and question for a moment what they were doing. If you remember, there was a scene where, as it was in the last Bourne movie, he's on the run, and he's got the scientist who is part of the mental research. Again, it was a brain program, and he asks her about what the research that she was involved in, and she gets real excited talking about the technical details, because it's really kind of an intellectual puzzle for her that she likes to solve. And then he gradually brings her to the realization of the ethical consequences of what she's doing. So many times scientists don't look at that, but let's look at what they're actually talking about doing, just apart from the ethics here. It says that they're going to be dealing with everything from stopping plagues to building synthetic soldiers. Well, that's what they would like us to think. It says DARPA has been busy exploring the increasingly dynamic intersection of biology and physical sciences. That's a quote from DARPA. I guess you could say they're going to boldly go where no one with ethics would want to go. And then they talk next about the transhuman soldier. Advanced prosthetics featuring mind-controlled limbs, neural interfaces, the ability to survive blood loss. And then we get into some other things, and we're running out of time right now. We're going to be right back with that, and with Alex's special report on climate change. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Saw there, when you remove the ethical constraints, what is the government capable of doing? What is society capable of doing? Well, there apparently are very little, if any, ethical constraints in our society. So let's take a look at the technical constraints and see what these people who are devoid of any ethics are doing to get around their technical constraints. I kept getting sidetracked in the previous segment and trying to talk about this transhumanist future soldier that DARPA is trying to create. Let me avoid talking about the ethics for a moment and just lay out the raw data that is documented here in this article about what DARPA is trying to do. They've got a biochronicity program where they want to get a handle on the human metabolism and on aging. Yeah, that's the time and aging, that sort of thing, resulting in an enhanced human combat performance and a freakishly resilient soldier, both in terms of resisting and recovering from physical injury and resistance to disease. They also want to seek out and create new life, according to this article. The Pentagon also wants to dabble in artificial life. That's right, creating chimeras, things that are mixtures of different creatures, even things that have never existed in any form, in any shape. Once refined, this biotechnology will allow for the creation of entirely new organisms while adding new capacities or quote-unquote features to existing ones, including humans. Imagine a soldier who never needs to sleep, who requires minimal sustenance, or who has cat-like infrared vision. A new study suggests that dogs and cats can see things that are invisible to humans, from psychedelic stripes on flowers to flashy patterned feathers. So why not give humans that kind of capability? Interestingly, this meshes well with DARPA's existing biodesign program, he points out, and they have a quote here. Why bother with mechanical robots when you can engineer fake human replicants to fight your battles? We haven't heard much about Pentagon's would-be synthetic soldiers, but the biodesign program got a bump from $11.4 to $19.3 million in next year's budget. But of course, that's a small amount of money compared to the amount of money that they're spending on the brain program. And for those of you who might look at that and say, hey, that's cool, I would love to be able to see in the dark like a cat. Well, guess what? They're not going to put out a super soldier like Captain America. As we talked about when we talked about the movie with the Infowars crew, the guy who was a scientist there was very concerned that they had the right kind of person, the right kind of moral foundation in that person before he gave him those kinds of powers. They're not looking for that. They're looking for just the opposite. As a matter of fact, if you happen to have moral foundations, that's not going to be a problem for DARPA because their key thing is to adjust and control your brain. So if they can give you physical capability, you can bet that they're going to do something to control your brain. If you accept that physical capability, you're going to be accepting that brain control as well. Now, I've been promising that Alex was going to give us a special report on climate change, and we've got that report. Here it is.
Across the northern hemisphere in 2013 and early 2014, we have seen record low temperatures. Some of them the coldest temperatures ever recorded in the last 300 years since thermometers were invented. The Great Lakes entirely froze over. The Arctic and Antarctic, in their respective winters, saw record growth in the ice. But what does Al Gore and CNN and MSNBC and the UN and the BBC do? They show you weather satellites from the poles during the summers and show the ice shrinking, as it's always done for thousands of years with the northern and southern passages that were even documented in the time of the Vikings. They lie to people and say that penguins cannot swim in the Antarctic and that in the Arctic, polar bears are dying, even though National Geographic has to admit polar bear numbers are up 5-fold since the 1950s and are now invading areas not previously known to be in their range. But that doesn't matter. Obama said you could keep your doctor. Then he said he never said you could keep your doctor.
If you've got health care already, then you can keep your plan if you are satisfied with it. If you like the plan you have, you can keep it. I intend to keep this promise. If you like your health care plan, you'll be able to keep your health care plan. If you like your plan and your doctor, you can keep them.
He said it wouldn't raise your premium, even though it did. So why not tell you that polar bears can't swim? Why not tell school kids they're all going to die if we don't pay Al Gore and the UN trillions of dollars in carbon taxes? Well, now because they're losing the debate, and it's been shown in the UN's own numbers that since the mid-90s, the Earth's temperature has actually dropped slightly, that there are natural cycles, they can't deal with those facts. So all over British and European news, but also here in the U.S., we've seen professors and others come out and call for the arrest of people that question anthropogenic or man-made global warming. And the latest is in the Times of London. With a straight face, one of the biggest papers in England talks about ministers and the committee in Parliament calling for people to not be allowed, including members of government, to question the, quote, consensus that man-made global warming is not man-made. Well, there is no consensus. In fact, the facade of the consensus is collapsing. The consensus is forming that the only thing that's steady is change itself. If you want to see the article, the headline is "Crackdown Ordered on Climate Change Skeptics." That sounds like something out of the old Soviet Union. Then we segue into Al Gore and his new move to produce a Inconvenient Truth Part 2 with new lies for old. Bottom line, we have an authoritarian movement on the so-called left that is seeking to not just tax every form of human activity and track it, but to also silence anyone that would dare challenge it. These people are not liberals. They are out-of-control authoritarians. But I wanted to reach out to some of the mainline supporters of this who really mean well, and I want to discuss some of the real environmental threats to this planet. Open-air genetic engineering of plants for pharmacological crops, where viruses and bacteria are mixed into the genetic code of mainline staple food crops that then infect the entire family of, say, corn or canola, has been proven in major studies to cross the genetic line into animals and humans that eat it, damaging our DNA. We know that toxic waste dumping is a serious problem. We know that overfishing in many areas is a serious issue. We know that the development of superbugs because of the overuse of antibiotics is threatening not just human life, but much of animal life on this planet. But when you enter into the equation Earth changes and giant asteroids, a 2-mile across nickel asteroid would be estimated to be the equivalent of thousands of Hiroshimas or Nagasaki's. And that's something that humans don't have control over. That's something that paying a tax to Al Gore will not fix. Then you enter volcanic and seismic activity. Huge earthquakes from Chile to off the coast of Japan in the last few weeks, as well as California, as the Pacific Rim heats up. But government scientists tell us, don't worry, in the geological record, big events like this only happen every few 100,000 years, and we don't think we're due. They have no idea on the real geological line how often these events really happen. But what we know is many civilizations have been destroyed or damaged by them. We know the world is hit by huge earthquakes and tsunamis on a routine basis, causing tens of thousands to die every single year. But because these are threats that the government can't even pretend to control, they tell us it's no big deal, it's not an issue. I go back to this all the time. Honeybees kill more than 200 people a year in the U.S. alone, more than international terrorism combined. But we're not seeing Homeland Security checkpoints out on the road to stop honeybees because it's something that we know is just a risk in the environment inherently, just like earthquakes, just like tsunamis. What do you do to mitigate against earthquakes and tsunamis? You don't live in those zones, or you live in a home that is designed to mitigate the danger from living in those zones. The truth is, the greatest danger historically is government. In the 20th century, according to the University of Hawaii, 262 million innocents, non-military personnel, were killed by government, were executed, were murdered, in many cases raped and tortured before they were killed. Statistically, it's not earthquakes, it's not asteroids, it's not flesh-eating bacteria, it's not cigarettes, it's not firearms, it's not honeybees, it's not great white sharks that are the danger that kill 5 people a year, but everybody's scared of them. No, ladies and gentlemen, it's government taken over by out-of-control criminal interest. And when governments start trying to say, we're not going to let you be pro-Second Amendment, or we're not going to let you promote your views on climate and the fact that the earth is always going through changes, we're going to shut you up. We're not going to let television have you on as guests. That's what they're proposing. You know you're dealing with the real threat that has reared its head throughout history. It's called despotism, it's called oppression, it's called tyranny. And across the world, it's on the march. But for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, to quote Sir Isaac Newton. And there is a response, a sleeping giant of free humanity that is awakening and beginning to move against the tyranny. The future, the destiny of civilization and freedom is in your hands. Alex Jones signing off for Infowars.com. Now back to David Knight and the worldwide radio transmission on this Friday edition. We'll be back this Sunday live as well with more live reports and special commentary.
That's exactly right. As Alex was pointing out, they're going to try to censor people that they don't agree with, but we also see that they do other things. They also create fake social media outlets. There was a stir this week as we learned that the U.S. government was creating a fake Cuban Twitter account. We have a report from Leanne McAdoo that aired on the nightly news last night. But remember that they have two ways that they do this. We just saw in Turkey how they would shut down Twitter, how they would shut down YouTube because there was a video on YouTube about a false flag attack being planned by the highest levels of the Turkish civilian government, the government there, as well as the intelligence commission and the military. They were all planning to do a false flag so they could start a war with Syria. So what did they do? They shut down YouTube to the entire country. But they can also do the opposite. They can also, as we've seen many times in the past with Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and now with the Cuban Twitter account, they can use information in their PSYOP war. Here's that report from Leanne McAdoo from the nightly news last night.
The U.S. government created a secret social media platform aimed at taking down Cuba's communist government. With the recent introduction of cell phone use in Cuba, U.S. officials saw the perfect opportunity to reach hundreds of thousands on the island. The plan was to launch a Cuban Twitter, using cell phone text messaging to evade Cuba's strict control of information and internet regulation. Initially, users would receive non-controversial content like news messages on soccer games or music and hurricane updates. Later, when the network reached a critical mass of subscribers, operators would introduce political content aimed at inspiring Cubans to organize smart mobs, mass gatherings called at a moment's notice that might trigger a Cuban spring. This was incredibly dangerous for the some 40,000 young Cubans who were interacting with the platform. They had no idea that the messages they thought were uninfluenced by their government were in fact financed by the U.S. government and influenced by its agenda. Social media platforms like Twitter have aided uprisings in several countries, and in 2011, Hillary Clinton admitted the U.S. helped people in oppressive internet environments get around filters. There's no telling how many of these uprisings have been financed and influenced by the U.S. government. But while the U.S. government admits that social media is a powerful tool in taking down regimes overseas, it wouldn't like to see technology having that same effect here in America. That's why every year we're seeing legislation like SOPA, CISPA, and PIPA, as well as the executive order signed by Obama that gives him the authority to shut down the internet. Instruments to fight the enemy abroad are now being used as tools of tyranny here in America. Tanks used for war are now being brought to our streets. Urban warfare training has increased at home, and we are being openly propagandized too thanks to last year's reform of the Smith-Month Act. The lifting of the propaganda ban will now allow a vast ocean of programming by Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and other media, which is now heard in over 100 countries, to be heard here at home as well.
Talk radio is and was the original alternative media. When print was controlled, when the TV was controlled, only 3 channels, it was talk radio where people could call in and talk about things, and so many stories would break regionally that would end up becoming, very important. And it was the place that could change what was happening legislatively. Government, tyrants in government, have always feared talk radio. And they're doing everything they can to kill it now.
And in response to a government losing the info war, NSA champion Mike Rogers will be coming to a radio station near you.
We're going to be right back with the White House defending that practice. That's the update from today. That was last night's
A lot of people's lives and...
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight. Now, in that last segment, you heard Leanne McAdoo's special report about the fake Cuban Twitter account that was set up by the American government. Today, we have a reaction to that. But before I go to that, let me point out that if you're a Prisonplanet TV member, that not only helps to support our operation, helps to pay salaries for people like Leanne, myself, Jakari, and others, all the support staff, it also is a way that you can help wake people up, friends and family. You can share that with up to 10 other people can watch at the same time. And of course, at Prisonplanet TV, all of Alex Jones's excellent documentaries are there. Another great way to wake people up. But we condensed the news down into a very fast-paced 30-minute program with special reports and updates. And, of course, yesterday, the thing that was breaking that Leanne reported on was this fake Cuban Twitter account. It's one of the articles that we covered last night. a fake PSYOP operation against the government of Cuba. But it gives us insight into what the American government is doing. And as Leanne pointed out, the instruments of fighting your enemies abroad tend to come back and be used against you as instruments of tyranny at home. And of course, we are seeing that in spades now, especially in the PSYOP war, in the information war. But listen to this reaction from the White House trying to defend this. First of all, the reaction of a couple of senior Democrats in the Congressional Intelligence and Judiciary Committees. They said they had known nothing about the effort. I know nothing. I'm not involved with that. Distanced themselves from it. And they described it as dumb, dumb, dumb. Yeah, it was dumb. But because it got exposed, okay? This is one of the things that was in a memo that got uncovered. This was a memo from Mobile Accord Incorporated, one of the project's creators. And they said, there will be absolutely no mention of the United States government's involvement, and this is absolutely crucial for the long-term success of the service and to ensure the success of the mission. So it was a covert PSYOP mission to get people roped into a social media network and then use that social media network to try to change public opinion. Where have we heard that before? Would that be like Facebook or Google or so many other outlets on the internet? The internet, I think, was initially designed by the same people we've been talking about creating a biotech transhuman future soldier, DARPA. You know, they started the internet, but we can take those weapons and use them against them. This is one of the things that came up in this was they were talking to, they have USAID's top official, Rajiv Shah, is scheduled to testify on Tuesday before the Senate Appropriations Committee. Now, where have you heard USAID before? Well, that's the corporation that is often the front group for the CIA. That's the corporation that Obama's mother worked for, if you remember. That's what she was doing when they were out of the country, where he grew up out of the country. A very disturbing thing to see here. But again, it's more of the same as we see. And of course, they're saying that the Republican chairman of the House Oversight Committee said he too would like to look into the program. Come on, don't tell me that Mike Rogers didn't know all about this. He's just not going to dump on these people because he is such a quisling for the security state. And it's another reason why I think he's moving to talk radio is because I don't think he could get elected dog catcher. I think we could get people on the left and the right to chip together to keep Mike Rogers out if he had decided to run. But he is heading for the hills because they don't want to wind up with egg on their face. And talking about bridging the differences between the left and the right, here we see something from the ACLU.org. Have we become a surveillance state? A 5-part test. And here's the 5 questions they have. Capacity. To what extent have we reached the point where we're technologically capable of building a total surveillance state? Number 2, infrastructure. To what extent have we created an infrastructure for the mass surveillance state? We're out of time, but I tell you what, the answer to that is yes, we do have a police state. We had William Binney, one of the top whistleblowers ever from the NSA. He had technical responsibilities that were global, and he said we have arrived at the police state. Well, that's it for today. We're going to be back on Sunday at 4 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Eastern. Join us then.